Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I didn't know it would be my last shift when I stepped into St. Jude's that evening. The air outside had that dry stillness that creeps in just before a snowstorm. Cold, weighty, not sharp but slow. Minneapolis had already seen its first frost, and there was talk on the radio about the possibility of sleet overnight, though I hadn't checked the forecast myself. I parked on level 3 of the staff garage and noticed how quiet it was for a Thursday. The usual shuffle of day shift nurses saying their goodbyes, or interns sneaking cigarettes before heading home wasn't there. Just the occasional echo of a car door and the wind scraping past the concrete. I walked through the service entrance, past the vending machines, and down into the locker corridor. The fluorescent lights above me hummed like always, but one of them flickered intermittently, casting long, pale shadows that jumped every few seconds. The hospital had always been half in disrepair, too old to be modern, but too stubborn to be replaced. I remember thinking that if something ever went wrong in the world, really wrong, St. Jude's would be the kind of place that somehow kept operating through it, powered by duct tape, caffeine, and sheer inertia. At the nurses' station outside the ER trauma bays, the board already had 17 names scrawled across it in sharp red dry erase. Respiratory distress, fever, confusion, another with acute chest pain. Nothing unusual for early flu season on the surface, but the energy was off. Jen, one of the senior nurses, passed me with a disposable gown balled under her arm and her face blank. She didn't even say hi, and Jen always had something to say, usually sarcastic. I scanned the waiting room through the glass partition. It was fuller than normal. That time of evening, we'd usually see a few parents with sick kids, maybe a sprained ankle from a high school game. But tonight, it was all adults, slumped over, sweating, whispering into their sleeves. One woman was sitting upright but staring straight ahead, unmoving. An orderly walked past her and she didn't flinch, didn't look. A child was there too, curled up against his mother's leg, not crying, not even fidgeting, just silent. That silence felt wrong, even through glass. I clocked in and made my way down the corridor. Bay 2 had the privacy curtain pulled all the way around, which usually meant restraint or isolation. As I passed, I heard what sounded like slow breathing, but off rhythm, like someone was trying to breathe in more than they could. I didn't linger. Trauma Bay 3's door was half open, and Dr. Kim was inside adjusting an IV. He glanced at me as I stepped in and asked if I was taking over from Daria. I nodded, pulled on gloves, and checked the patient's chart. Early 30s, male, brought in 2 hours ago by Hennepin County EMTs. No ID. He had collapsed in the hallway of a transitional shelter and reportedly became agitated during transport. No record of drug use. No psychiatric history noted, though that didn't always mean much. He was restrained to the bed, leather cuffs at both wrists, heavy ones, the kind we only used if someone was violently uncooperative. The man's eyes were open, not darting around but fixed upward toward the ceiling tiles, as if watching something I couldn't see. He had a bite wound along his lower lip that looked older than the incident report implied. His breathing was shallow but irregular, and every now and then his fingers would twitch in little patterns like counting something. I checked his vitals. Temperature was elevated, heart rate high but not off the charts. His skin was pale but not cyanotic. Dr. Kim quietly said they'd already run a tox screen. Nothing came back. CT was clean. Blood work was inconclusive but nothing suggested bacterial infection. No obvious explanation. He was one of 3 patients admitted since yesterday with similar presentation. While we spoke, a crash came from Trauma 1. A monitor stand slammed to the ground, followed by someone shouting for assistance. Kim rushed out. I followed. Inside, 2 techs were struggling to restrain a man in his 40s who'd come in earlier complaining of chest pressure. He was now upright on the gurney, eyes blank, limbs jerking. Not a seizure. The movement was too purposeful. One of the techs was pinned between the wall and the gurney, her arm caught under his. She didn't scream, just gritted her teeth and kept pushing. I saw Kim move in with a syringe. I grabbed the shoulder strap of the patient's gown and leaned my weight forward, trying to anchor him. For a moment, I caught his eyes. There was nothing behind them. No fear, no confusion, just absence. Kim managed to get the sedative in, and the patient started to go slack. But it wasn't like normal sedation. His muscles loosened one at a time, like a puppet with its strings slowly cut. It was eerie in a way I still don't have words for. Back in the hallway, I washed my hands longer than necessary. The soap dispenser wheezed empty halfway through, and I had to switch to another. I stared at my reflection in the steel paper towel bin, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Not one patient, not two, but 5 now showing nearly identical symptoms with no shared exposure site, no shared travel history, and no clear pathogen. That wasn't flu, it wasn't meningitis. I've worked through flu seasons, H1N1, RSV, you name it. This wasn't like that. By the time it hit 9, the waiting room had grown. A few people began coughing violently, deep rattling sounds from the lungs. One woman in her 70s was helped into a wheelchair and promptly vomited onto the floor. The janitor didn't respond for over 10 minutes. When he did, he looked unsteady himself. Jen came back around and told me Trauma 4 had gone dark. The power in that bay flickered and then shut off completely. The patient inside, a man in his 20s with high fever and disorientation, had apparently torn off his IV and tried to walk out. A tech had found him standing in the hallway barefoot, mumbling about static. I asked Jen if administration was aware. She said they'd called up, but no one had answered from the admin floor in over an hour. Then came the announcement. It started with a tone, then the flat voice of the hospital-wide PA system. Not an overhead announcement from security, but a pre-programmed protocol. Attention all medical personnel. Emergency protocol now in effect. Unidentified infection spreading. Initiate containment procedures. Trauma bays 1 through 6 to be sealed. Restrict patient movement. Await further instruction. No explanation. No escalation. Just immediate lockdown language. Most of us froze. The room didn't go quiet so much as still. The machines still beeped. The printers still spat out wristbands. The LED signs still blinked over the triage door. But the people had stopped moving. For a few seconds, I think we all expected someone, anyone, to clarify. None came. 10 minutes later, 2 military Humvees pulled up to the ambulance bay. Not police, not National Guard. Plain uniformed personnel in tactical gear, but light. More like what you'd see at a natural disaster site. They began offloading triage crates and sealing the bay doors behind them. The last ambulance of the night arrived at 10:15 and was not allowed to unload. The driver got out, shouted something, and was waved off. After that, we were on our own. Internal comms failed next. Not completely, but spotty. We tried to text. I messaged my sister Elena, who lives in Roseville. She replied once, asked what was happening. I told her to stay home. She said she was already in her car. Said she'd heard something on the scanner about a containment perimeter. I told her again, do not come downtown. The roads would be blocked. Her last message was a single word, trying. In the ER, security began locking doors from the inside. Visitors were rerouted to the cafeteria on the 2nd floor, kept under watch by 2 plainclothes security leads. No one was allowed to leave the ER wing, not even staff. Dr. Sanchez protested, said she had a family to check on. She was ignored. No one shouted, no threats, just protocol, enforced by people who wouldn't answer questions. By midnight, 6 bays were at full capacity, all exhibiting similar symptom sets. Some became combative, others became entirely unresponsive, just staring, as if waiting for something. Dr. Kim suggested moving some patients to sub-level quarantine, but we didn't have clearance. The access codes had changed. A woman named Alice, who'd been stable earlier, began humming. Low, soft, almost like tuning a note. I was checking her vitals when she began. I didn't recognize the tone. It wasn't musical exactly. It was more like resonance. I asked if she was in pain. She didn't respond. Then she stopped mid-hum, blinked once, and asked why the lights were flickering. They weren't. Not then. Not to me. But just as I opened my mouth to tell her so, the fixtures above gave a soft buzz and pulsed. Not fully dark, just a soft dip in brightness like a voltage hiccup. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't staring straight into the ceiling. I looked over at the hallway, where Dr. Kim stood motionless, his hands still gloved, one latex fingertip idly tapping against the chart he held like a metronome. His gaze was fixed upward at the same light, his brow furrowed. When he looked at me, I saw it. He was trying to rationalize it too. The pause between our words stretched longer than it should have. "I'll get her moved," I finally said, barely louder than the soft hissing of the oxygen line. But I didn't move right away. I took another look at Alice. Her breathing had slowed, not dangerously but unnaturally, rhythmic and deliberate, as if she were counting each inhale and giving it space before letting it go. Her pupils were constricted, almost pinholes, no reaction to the penlight, but she was still conscious, still tracking me. I wrote down her stats, noted the anomaly, and stepped out of the bay. Dr. Kim was gone. I found him down by the break room, standing by the microwave with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. The hallways felt too open, the walls too silent for casual talk. At some point between midnight and 1, the power dipped again. This time not just a flicker, but a full second of black. Backup kicked in almost immediately, humming to life with that strange mechanical whine unique to hospital systems. But still, it was enough to make some of the monitors reset. IV pumps had to be recalibrated. One of the auto-lock doors to Bay 5 remained sealed even after override. Staff from radiology reported full system outages. MRI was offline, CT was idle. The elevator panels glitched, skipping floors or freezing altogether. I went back to the nurse's station and tried to log into the main console, but the system stalled. I waited. Nothing. I turned to Jen, who had returned from the overflow wing. She shook her head and muttered something about the network timing out again. Behind her, the intercom gave another sharp tone, shorter this time, followed by static that stayed on for almost 15 seconds before it clicked off. No voice, just that hiss of white noise. No one acknowledged it out loud, but I saw the way people looked toward the ceiling, expecting a follow-up that never came. By then, we'd heard rumors from upstairs. Pediatrics was being evacuated. No one said why. I overheard one of the techs say that an entire unit had been cleared floor by floor and that people were being held near the rooftop helipad, not for medevac, just held. The elevators to the top levels had been disabled manually. Stair access was locked on the emergency side. Whoever had made that decision hadn't told us. Bay 6 went quiet. The monitor readouts had flatlined, not for vitals but for the actual feed, as if someone had pulled the data cables. I sent Randy, one of the newer orderlies, to check. He was gone for almost 5 minutes before I followed. The curtain had been ripped down from one side. Not torn, but detached from the rail, like someone had pulled it deliberately. Inside, the patient was still strapped in place. Her eyes were closed. Her wrists were raw from struggling against the leather. The restraints had bite marks on them. Not scratches, not cuts. Bite impressions. She hadn't tried to escape. She had tried to break the cuffs with her teeth. Randy stood in the corner, just staring. He didn't notice me until I touched his shoulder. "She wasn't like this earlier," he said. His voice had dropped to a whisper. "I checked on her 40 minutes ago. She wasn't even moving then. Now look." I told him to step out and take a break. He nodded but didn't leave. I had to nudge him toward the hallway before he finally walked off. I pulled the curtain back into place and checked the monitors. All readings had gone null. I reset the panel. Still nothing. The patient was unconscious, but her breathing was still too steady, too methodical to be natural. I noted it and returned to the station. At around 1:30, we received a sealed case labeled CDC Red. It was delivered to the ER intake bay, left just inside the sliding doors by one of the military personnel. He didn't come in, just wheeled the case inside, gave us a nod, and walked out. No explanation. Inside were full-body isolation suits, higher-grade masks, and a printed document without letterhead. It instructed us to categorize certain symptoms as Class A markers, though it didn't define what that meant. The listed signs were already familiar: sudden respiratory failure, erratic body temperature shifts, fixed gaze response, unprovoked aggression. The paper ended with a line in bold text. Do not attempt to transport affected individuals outside of hospital grounds under any circumstance. That language wasn't medical, it was operational. Someone in admin must have escalated, because shortly after, we were handed down orders to secure a perimeter around the trauma bays. Tape lines, barricades, lockdown protocols. The kind we trained for during active shooter drills, but never actually used. I helped stack gurneys across access points and taped off glass doors with biohazard signage. We weren't trained for this. We didn't have protocols for this many unknowns. The medical language was gone now. It had shifted entirely into containment. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a message from Elena. Nothing new. I called twice. Voicemail. Tried her husband. No answer. The roads must have been blocked already. She had no reason to be downtown other than me. She should have stayed home. But I knew her. She wouldn't. She'd drive through half the city if she thought I was in trouble. By 2 a.m, all intake had stopped. The sliding doors to the emergency entrance were locked manually with chains. No one came in. No one went out. Bay 4's patient flatlined at 2:13. Code Blue was called, but no one rushed in. Dr. Kim said to leave him be. That was the new instruction. If they went flat, wait 5 minutes before resuscitation. Not for safety, for observation. We watched the clock. At minute 4, the man blinked. No pulse, no respiration, but he blinked. Then he moved his jaw slightly, like trying to speak. Kim nodded once and left the room. No one else touched the patient. The smell in the ER had changed. Not from blood or bodily fluids, that's normal, but something metallic had crept into the air, sharp and dry like burnt ozone. The oxygen tanks were fine, no leaks. The ventilation hadn't changed, but that smell lingered like it was baked into the drywall. A nurse named Carissa approached me at the station. She hadn't spoken much all night, but now she leaned close and said something I still think about. She asked, "What if this isn't a virus?" I didn't respond. I just stared at the patient log, watching the admission numbers hold steady. 38 confirmed, 20 unconfirmed, 3 fatal, 5 combative. That was the official count, but it didn't feel like enough. That number didn't reflect what we were seeing in the halls. People slumped in chairs, half asleep or too still. Staff members losing track of time, of tasks. Supplies gone missing, rooms left open. Someone had emptied the staff fridge. No one admitted to it. Around 2:30, the cafeteria lights above the mezzanine began pulsing. Not flickering, pulsing. A low cycle every 3 seconds. I could see it through the upper windows of the ER. A rhythm, a signal. I radioed security. No reply. I went to find Jen. She was in the stairwell, sitting 2 steps up with her head resting against the wall. Her hands were clasped together, fingers shaking. She looked up at me and asked, "Is it happening everywhere?" I didn't know what to say. Behind us, through the small glass window in the stairwell door, I saw movement. Not someone walking, not someone running, just a slow drift of motion, shadows that didn't align with the lights above them. I backed away and pulled Jen up. We moved back to the ER wing, locking the stairwell behind us. At 3 a.m, the intercom clicked again, but this time, no words. Just a low humming tone, then silence. No one slept, not even the patients who should have been sedated. The ones in the sealed bays stayed motionless, eyes open, breathing slow, watching, always watching. You can only pretend things are normal for so long, before the quiet starts to turn on you. In the ER that night, the lights never fully came back to life after the last brownout. The backup systems worked technically, but there was a visible dimness to every hallway, like someone had turned down the contrast on the entire hospital. All the surfaces looked waxy, colors bled into shadows. The green on the vitals monitors didn't shine the way it normally did. It just hovered there, faded and flat, like a memory. The silence wasn't peaceful either. It was an exhausted, frayed sort of stillness, the kind that clings to people after too many hours without answers. I remember standing by the supply closet, staring at an unopened box of gloves for what felt like a full minute before realizing I didn't remember walking there. My thoughts weren't racing. They were stuck, like a skipping record. Every few seconds I had to blink hard, just to anchor myself again. I thought it was just me, but when I glanced back down the hall, I saw Jen leaning with both hands braced against the wall, her head lowered, not moving. Dr. Kim had disappeared again. So had Carissa. The station was unmanned for at least 15 minutes before anyone noticed. None of us were doing anything. Not out of fear, or exhaustion exactly. Just disconnection. Bay 2's monitors suddenly flared bright green, all readings spiking. The noise snapped the fog out of the air. I ran toward the sound just as Kim and a younger resident, Samir, came sprinting from the overflow corridor. The patient in the bay had been nonverbal for over an hour, restrained after exhibiting signs of psychotic agitation. We hadn't expected movement, let alone a full cardiac surge. He was sitting up, not struggling, but rigid, like his spine had straightened on its own. His fingers were clenched so tightly that the restraints had torn shallow red grooves into his wrists, but he didn't seem to notice. His mouth opened slightly, and a soft wheeze escaped, but not like he was out of breath. It was measured, like he was trying to shape something into sound, and couldn't quite manage it. Samir moved toward him with a light sedative, but Kim stopped him. "No," he said quietly. "Let's just observe." I glanced at him, confused. That wasn't protocol. It wasn't even medicine. But the way Kim's voice sounded, like he wasn't just seeing a patient anymore, like he was studying something foreign. I didn't argue. I stood by the door and watched as the patient began to twitch, only slightly, a toe shifting, a shoulder tilt. Then nothing. His vitals returned to baseline. His eyes remained open. When I returned to the main station, Randy was there, eyes glued to the internal monitors. He had pulled up the hospital's internal security feed. All across the screen were frozen frames, the cafeteria, the east wing, the visitor elevators. None of the footage was moving, and none of it had updated since around 2:45. That had been nearly an hour ago. "I've been trying to reset the feed," Randy said, not looking up. "No signal. Local storage must have failed, or been shut off." I didn't have time to process what that meant. The radio on the desk crackled, one of the older walkie units we'd been using in place of the intercoms. A voice, barely audible, came through. "Main stairwell. Breach. Containment. Failed. Keep doors." Then nothing but static. I picked it up and tried to respond, but there was no return channel. The signal had either been lost or jammed. I turned to Randy. His hands were trembling, but he wasn't panicking. He looked like someone deep into shock, focused, but empty. We decided to lock the ER completely. All corridors leading out, both public and staff side, were sealed. We used crash bars, metal carts, anything that could reinforce the weak points. A few of the patients in the open ward began murmuring to each other, though they weren't making much sense. One kept repeating a number over and over. Not a room number, not a date, just a string of digits that didn't go anywhere. Another, a woman in her late 50s, who had been lucid until that point, asked if the windows had started breathing yet. When I asked what she meant, she just laughed, dry, hollow. We moved her to observation. She didn't resist. By 4 in the morning, the overhead lights began to strobe in sequence. First 2, then 4, then all of them, flickering in a synchronized rhythm. It didn't seem like a power surge. It was too orderly, too clean. Someone suggested the emergency protocols had triggered a lockdown pattern, but the flickering wasn't like a warning. It felt like a signal. And then came the noise. Not from inside the ER, but from the floors above. A distant metallic ringing, rhythmic, echoing down the vent shafts and tile corridors. It sounded like something hollow being dragged, slowly, then dropped, repeated, over and over. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the patients stopped murmuring. I couldn't tell what floor it was coming from. I couldn't even tell what side of the building it was on. The sound felt omnipresent, as if it were coming through the walls, not around them. Jen finally spoke, her voice shaking. "Do you think someone's trying to get out?" I wanted to say no. I didn't. Shortly after that, the cafeteria windows shattered. We heard the crash before we saw anything. It echoed down the main corridor like a car wreck, glass and metal and an unnatural shriek that didn't sound mechanical or human, just raw. One of the security staff sprinted to the upper window that overlooked the second-floor mezzanine. He took one look and backed away, fast. When I got to the window, I saw the damage, but no people. Chairs overturned, tables shattered. The far wall was smeared with something dark and uneven, but no bodies, no movement, just debris and broken light. The patient log was irrelevant by then. Most of the admitted were no longer in beds. Some were curled in corners. Some were pacing without direction. A few had laid down and simply stopped responding, still breathing, but no longer blinking. One man had crouched beneath the nurse's station, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, whispering fragments of nursery rhymes to no one. Jen and I moved through the hallway to check the quarantine bays. 2 were empty. The restraints had been removed. We hadn't done it. Dr. Kim was in the staff lounge, sitting perfectly still with a clipboard in his lap, staring at a blank piece of paper. I asked him what he was doing, and he said, "Listening." Nothing else. Just that. I didn't push him. There was nothing left to say. Around 5, a message came through the wall-mounted TV in the main waiting area. It hadn't worked for hours, but now it was glowing, faintly, with a static-filled banner. "Stay indoors. Isolate all affected. Avoid direct contact. This is a nationwide emergency." No logos, no voiceover, no live feed. Just that white text on grey static. One of the techs, Miguel, walked up beside me, pointed at the screen and said, "It's been looping every 20 minutes, same phrasing. Nothing new. Not even a timestamp." He had rings under his eyes like he hadn't blinked in an hour. That's when the smell got worse. It was chemical now, sharp and artificial, like scorched plastic or overheated wiring. But there was no fire, no smoke. We checked the breaker panel, all green. The HVAC showed stable. But the smell didn't go away. It just thickened, as if the air had started decaying. At 5:30, the patients began to hum. Not all of them, but enough to feel like a chorus. Low tones, not synchronized, but overlapping, layered. They didn't look at each other, didn't acknowledge anything. They just hummed, like something was reverberating through them. One patient covered her ears and began to scream. Another collapsed, unresponsive. A third walked directly into the nearest wall and didn't stop until he dropped. We pulled the remaining coherent patients into Trauma 1 and sealed it with a crash bar and gurney. We moved fast, not discussing it. We just acted. I checked my phone again. 1 bar. A single text came through. "Elena. At the bridge. National Guard. They're not letting anyone past." No follow-up. No response when I called. She must have been trying to reach the 3rd Avenue bridge. That entire zone had been shut down. I didn't know if she was alone or still in the car. I didn't know if she was on foot. The idea of her being anywhere near this city made my stomach turn. As the sky began to lighten, what little of it we could see through the upper vents, the humming stopped. So did the flickering. Everything went still again. For about 10 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of wind pressing against the outer glass. Then one of the patients spoke. A young man, early 20s, previously nonverbal and restrained after entering in an aggressive state. He stood upright without warning, pulled free of his straps, though they hadn't been loosened, and calmly stepped toward the edge of the bay. I was at the nurse's desk, trying to update the log by hand. I heard the shift of weight before I saw him. He moved without hesitation, each step measured, deliberate. There was no sign of disorientation or resistance. He didn't look around the room as if trying to reorient himself, and he didn't react to my presence, not even with curiosity. He simply moved to the center of the trauma bay and stood still, as if listening to something beyond the walls. When I called out his name, just a reflex, not even knowing if it was correct, he didn't flinch. His eyes were open but vacant, not confused, not frightened, just void of concern or awareness. Like the person who had arrived 3 hours earlier had left and something else remained behind. He didn't speak again, but before returning to the bed, he raised his hand and pressed it flat against the glass of the monitoring window. He left it there for 10 or 12 seconds. Then he sat back down and didn't move. No more signs of agitation. No attempt to escape. He returned to his previous posture like nothing had happened. It was as if the entire episode had only occurred to prove it could. I wrote it down, every detail. Not for anyone else, really, just for me, to remind myself that it happened, that I hadn't imagined it. At that point, the entire ER had become a sort of half-living thing, pulsing with unspoken tension. None of us trusted our senses anymore. The buzz of the fluorescents was louder, the clocks felt slower, even the beeping of the monitors sounded off, like the frequency had shifted. I checked them several times just to be sure I wasn't hearing phantom tones. Jen came back from the eastern corridor with blood on her scrubs. I rushed over, thinking she was injured, but she stopped me. It wasn't hers. She said she'd gone to check on the temporary ward where we'd moved 3 of the quieter patients earlier in the night. When she got there, the beds were empty. No one had authorized a transfer. The restraints had been cut, clean cuts, sharp and smooth. The med drawer had been emptied, but there were no signs of a struggle, no alarms tripped, no missing badges. She said the blood was smeared on the wall near the exit, but not like a spray or spill, more like someone had dragged a wet hand along the plaster. No footprints, no bodies. We double-checked the security system again. No new footage. The cameras had stopped updating completely sometime between 2:45 and 3 o'clock, depending on the hallway. Even now, the screens showed nothing but frozen stills from hours earlier, blurry shapes captured in motion, long since irrelevant. I left Jen at the station and made a slow sweep of the ER. The light outside was beginning to change, just enough to cast a faint glow through the west-facing windows. But it wasn't sunrise yet, just a dull wash, grey and directionless. I moved from bay to bay, checking vitals. Most of the patients were awake, not alert, not engaged, just awake, watching. Several had turned in their beds, their heads angled toward the walls as if expecting something to arrive through the concrete. One had pulled the sheet over his face entirely and hadn't moved since. I almost uncovered him to check for signs of life, but something stopped me. His chest was rising and falling in shallow rhythm. That was enough. I ended my rounds at the ER entrance, what used to be the main double doors that led out to the patient drop-off loop. They were locked now, chained and dark behind reinforced shutters. A single emergency light above them pulsed every 5 seconds. I stood there and counted each blink. 22 pulses before I noticed something. A reflection. In the strip of glass just above the door handles, barely visible through the grime and the metal overlay, there was movement outside. Not sharp or sudden, just faint shadows sliding across the entryway like people standing too close, waiting for the doors to open. I leaned in. The glass fogged slightly from my breath. I saw one distinct shape pause, human height, indistinct, but I could make out no features. The moment I stepped back, it moved on, joined by 2 more. They weren't trying to get in, they were waiting. Back at the station, Jen was reviewing the only live feed that remained functional, the external camera mounted on the south side of the building, facing the staff parking ramp. It had glitched intermittently throughout the night but always came back. Now it showed the snow-covered lot in full, but it wasn't empty. Dozens of cars had stopped there at odd angles. Some still had their lights on. Doors hung open. There was a pile-up near the entrance, where 3 or 4 vehicles had clearly collided. But no people, except one. Far off in the distance, standing in the road near the exit to Chicago Avenue, someone stood completely still, facing the building. Not walking, not pacing, just watching. Jen pointed to the monitor. They've been there for 20 minutes. I asked if the person had moved. She shook her head. Just appeared. The feed glitched. When it came back, the figure was gone. We didn't speak after that. There was nothing useful left to say. Around 6 o'clock, a low vibration rumbled through the floor. At first, I thought it was a vehicle, maybe a supply truck arriving late, but the sensation didn't rise or fall. It didn't follow the familiar cadence of engines or air compressors. It was steadier than that, like the entire facility had developed a pulse. The patients didn't react, neither did the lights, but the machines, every monitor, every scanner, every automatic system, each one gave a small delay on its next input, just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough to feel wrong, like the equipment had paused to listen. I looked down at the telemetry tablet in my hand. The screen froze. Not a crash, not a shutdown, just a static freeze of the last feed. Alice, in her bay, looking directly at the mounted camera with a faint smile. That image stayed on the screen even after I restarted the unit. I dropped it. Somewhere near the service corridor, a door slammed open. The sound of metal hitting tile rang out through the ER like a gunshot. We all jumped. Randy ran to check it and I followed. The hallway beyond was empty. No people, no noise. But the floor was wet, slick with what looked like saline or plasma solution. The janitor's cart was overturned at the end of the hall, and there, scrawled in faint letters across the glass of the fire exit door, was something drawn with a bare finger. "Stay inside, it doesn't want out." I stepped back instinctively. Randy read it twice, then looked at me. "Doesn't want out?" he asked. "Then what's it doing?" I didn't have an answer. I'm not sure I ever will. The intercom came alive one final time that morning. No tone, no announcement. Just the same humming resonance we'd heard hours earlier, but slower now, like it was winding down. That noise filled every corridor, every bay, every stairwell, and when it faded, the lights dimmed entirely. Not flickered, dimmed, as if the building had decided it didn't need them anymore. We stood in that silence, under emergency floodlights, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The patients remained still. The monitors stayed frozen. The staff stopped moving. The world had held its breath. And in that final hour before sunrise, with the wind outside gone still, and the city around us dark, I understood something I hadn't grasped until then. This wasn't a virus, not the kind we studied, not something alive in a traditional sense. It didn't spread through the air or water. It didn't multiply through cells or hijack immune systems. It didn't seek to kill or survive in the way we understood. It altered people not by attacking their bodies, but by rearranging the quiet between their thoughts. It made you forget what time was. It pulled your attention to meaningless things. It slowed your sense of urgency just enough to let inertia take over. I think that's why so many of us didn't panic. It didn't want panic. It wanted stillness, waiting, watching, breathing in rhythm with something we couldn't see. But not all of us fell into it. Something about those last hours, something changed. I don't know if it was daylight coming back, or the exhaustion reaching its peak. Maybe some primal part of the mind starts fighting back when you've been stuck in one place too long. Or maybe it was as simple as a distraction, a new sound, a new signal that broke the loop. It started with a tone on the backup radio. At 6:44 a.m., just as the first true streaks of dawn began bleeding into the upper windows, the old hospital radio in the corner of the nurse's station crackled with a high-pitched whine. Not the humming tone we'd heard earlier, but a crisp frequency spike followed by digital hiss, and then, faintly, a voice. "St. Jude, this is Mobile Relief Unit Echo 3. Respond if you are operational. Repeat, this is Echo 3 out of Fort McCoy. If you are receiving, we have visual confirmation of perimeter breach but no hostiles seen. Do you copy?" The first voice we'd heard in hours, and it wasn't inside the building. Randy bolted upright and grabbed the receiver, answering before I could even stand. His voice cracked, but he was clear. "This is St. Jude ER. We're operational but compromised. No power. Internal systems down. Approximate survivors. 11 staff. Unknown number of patients." There was a pause. Then, "We are about 1 mile west on Washington Avenue. Blockade at 10th and Portland is lifted. Repeat, route is open. We are standing by for extraction. Ground access only. Building marked for secondary assessment." Secondary assessment. That meant they weren't coming in unless we got out first. It took all of us working in silence. But by 7:10, we had cleared the north corridor. The side exit by radiology, never meant to be used for anything except maintenance, was our only remaining option. The main entrances were sealed under orders, and the elevator shaft had collapsed in on itself during the early tremors we'd felt overnight. The door by radiology was partially jammed, and the hallway beyond it had filled with debris from what looked like a ceiling duct failure. Still, we forced it open, inch by inch. I remember pushing a mop cart aside and seeing sunlight cut across the tile for the first time in almost 12 hours. Real light, cold and clear. I felt it on my face before I even stepped outside. It didn't feel like escape. Not yet. It felt like transition, like stepping between two moments in time that had no continuity. Inside was one reality, and outside was another. We carried what we could: patient records, a few units of stabilized insulin, a defibrillator. Jen had a satchel filled with her notes from the overnight shift. Dr. Kim walked at the rear of our group, one hand resting gently on Alice's shoulder. She walked calmly, unassisted, not speaking, just watching the sky. We passed 2 floors of stairwell windows before I saw them. 3 black uniformed figures on the far end of the street, standing near a military-style vehicle. No insignia, no markings, just matte paint and antennae bristling from the rear. One of them raised a hand when he saw us. He didn't wave, didn't gesture, just a flat palm, like a signal. We kept moving. Outside, the world felt both familiar and alien. Snow had fallen lightly during the early morning hours, leaving a dusting of white across abandoned cars and sidewalk benches. Some intersections were blocked with concrete barricades. Others were open, but lined with empty vehicles. Most of the traffic lights had lost power, but there was no smoke, no sirens, no distant chaos. Just a city paused in motion, like someone had hit the mute button halfway through a normal day. The extraction team didn't speak. They handed out respirator masks and checked pulses. They scanned each of us with a portable biometric reader and then gave a nod. We were loaded into the vehicle in silence. The back had been converted into a kind of field medical bay. Folded cots, a few supply crates, a filtered ventilation system. There were no windows. As the door shut behind us, I glanced back at the hospital. St. Jude looked smaller somehow, worn down. The top floors were dark. Several of the windows had cracked. There was a slow-moving leak of steam from a ruptured pipe on the east side of the building, and the front signage was gone, snapped at the middle where the wind had likely caught it during the night. That place had always been a strange hybrid of care and collapse, patched together over decades of underfunding and delayed renovations. Now it felt like it had fulfilled some final role no one had asked of it: a container, a filter, something to hold what was never meant to spread. And now it was empty. The ride to the staging area took less than 20 minutes. We were debriefed in a makeshift tent near the university campus. Most of the buildings there had been converted into coordination posts. Apparently, similar incidents had occurred in Chicago, St. Louis, and parts of Detroit. Not full-scale outbreaks, they said, but anomalous behavioral clusters. That's the term they used, behavioral clusters. They didn't tell us what it was. They didn't have to. We were screened for 72 hours. Blood tests, EEGs, Connecticut scans, psychological evaluations. Most of it came back clean, though I was told my circadian rhythm had been disrupted beyond typical sleep deprivation profiles. They said it would pass. Eleanor found me on the 4th day. She'd made it to a checkpoint outside the city and had been held there after mentioning my name and hospital. One of the guard officers recognized it on the manifest and flagged her for possible exposure. She waited 3 days in a converted school gymnasium, surrounded by other families trying to locate loved ones. When she finally reached me, she didn't speak right away. She just hugged me for a long time and whispered, "I told you I'd come." We were released 2 days later. They didn't tell us what would happen to the hospital. Some said it would be demolished. Others said it would be quarantined indefinitely. One of the relief staff mentioned an aerial scan that showed no movement inside for 3 days after we left. The lights never came back on. I don't know what happened to all of the patients. I know some made it out. Alice was taken in by a civilian health unit for ongoing evaluation. She hasn't spoken since that morning, but she responds to visual cues now. Last I heard, she was being transferred to a rural facility outside Duluth. Dr. Kim stayed on with the CDC. He volunteered for something called the Environmental Anomaly Task Group, whatever that means. Jen quit nursing altogether. She runs a greenhouse in Wisconsin now, says she doesn't look at screens anymore. As for me, I left the city. I moved west, closer to the border, found a small town with a community clinic. They were desperate for licensed staff. I took the job, not because I needed the work, but because I needed something to fill the days. The clinic is quiet. We get the usual cases: sprains, bronchitis, the occasional farm injury. Nothing strange, nothing abnormal. Every now and then, I'll see someone whose eyes linger too long or who hums quietly when no music is playing. But I don't write it down. I just listen. I just wait. The sky out here is different, cleaner. You can see more stars than I remembered. Some nights, when the wind dies and the houses settle, I lie on the porch and let the silence stretch. Not because I'm afraid, because I understand it now. Silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's just healing. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.